Ahoj všichni! Last week we dove into some of the Czech Easter traditions, but this week is also the week of Jewish Passover. And that's the perfect opportunity to learn more about the history of Jews in Prague and an excuse to cook my favorite Passover food, which is matzo ball soup. Now, I'm not Jewish, but I do love cooking, and I love any excuse to learn more about the history of the mother of cities. Did you know that was one of Prague's nicknames? It's quite fitting, don't you think? In fact, in one of the most accurate quotes about Prague, Franz Kafka, who is one of the most famous Czech Jews, said, "Prague never lets you go. This dear little mother has sharp claws." I was trying to describe what a matzo ball is to one of my Czech friends, and I kept saying it's like a round, doughy pasta type thing, and you put it in soup, and then I thought it's a knedlik. It's basically a dumpling. So if you're Czech, this soup is right up your alley. For the broth, we're gonna need celery and peppercorns, some garlic, carrots, parsley. More traditional is a chicken broth, but I like to keep my broth vegetarian. So if you visited Prague, you've certainly been to the Jewish Quarter, called Josefov. It's the smallest quarter in Prague, and its main street, Pařížská or Paris Street, is lined with luxury boutiques, and it intersects Old Town Square. But those beautiful ice cream colored Art Nouveau and Art Deco buildings are actually quite new. Well, in Prague terms. They were constructed at the beginning of the 20th century. So what did the Jewish Quarter look like before? Well, that's a long and tumultuous history. So today I'm going to talk about a few things to whet your appetite and encourage you to spend some more time in the Jewish Quarter the next time you come to Prague. The Jews have lived in Prague since at least the 10th century. It's one of Europe's oldest Jewish communities, and it was first mentioned in writing by a traveler who came and journaled his way through Europe, and he noted some of the Jews who were working in the markets in Prague. That's almost 400 years before the Charles Bridge was built. To make the matzo balls, you'll need to get matzo meal. It's pretty typical in all the supermarkets in Los Angeles, where I'm from, but I've never actually bought it in Prague. It usually comes with a soup mix or a powder, but I like to add vegetables to my broth to make it more flavorful. I'm going to chop these vegetables roughly because we're not going to eat them. We're just going to boil them to flavor the broth. Even the skins of the onions will add flavor and color to the broth. The oldest active synagogue in all of Europe is actually located in Prague. It was called the New Synagogue when it was built in 1270. But later, when some newer synagogues were built, it was a little confusing, and so it started to get referred to as the Old New Synagogue. The stones that were used to build this synagogue are said to have come all the way from the synagogue in Jerusalem, flown to Prague by angels. They were lent on the condition that when the Messiah finally comes, the stones will be returned to the synagogue in Jerusalem. Now we're going to cut the carrots and celery into big chunks. It doesn't matter if you leave on the stems as long as they've been thoroughly washed. Cut a big head of garlic horizontally so all that gorgeous garlic aroma gets released into the broth. Go ahead and toss it in, skins and all. You're probably very familiar with the six-pointed Jewish star that is a symbol of Judaism the world over. It's even on the flag of Israel. This is called the Magen David, but it actually only became a symbol for Jews in Prague. And I'm sure you've heard of Charles IV, the King of Bohemia, the Holy Roman Emperor. Well, he actually gave the Jews their first flag. And on that flag was the Shield of David, or the Star of David, the Magen David. Before then, this wasn't necessarily the symbol of Jews. Centuries later, after the 30 Years' War, the king wanted to honor the Jews for having fought valiantly against the enemy in defense of Prague, and so he awarded them a new flag, and this flag too had the Star of David on it. The original flag no longer exists, but there's a replica from the 18th century, and it's hung in the Old New Synagogue. Typically, the herb that's used in matzo ball soup is dill or koper, but for some reason my family always added parsley, and that's what we happen to have in our kitchen. The second half of the 16th century was considered the golden age for Jews in Prague. The King of Bohemia, Rudolf II, had relaxed a lot of the restrictions that had burdened the Jews during this time, and during his reign, their community in Prague flourished. In the early 18th century, Jews accounted for almost 1/4 of the population of Prague, and it was the biggest Jewish community in the entire world. Several new synagogues were built at this time. The Meisel Synagogue, the Pincus Synagogue, the High Synagogue, and the Jewish City Hall. This golden age came to an unfortunate end when Maria Theresa ascended to the throne in Austria. She was a real piece of work, and she expelled Jews from the empire as much as she could. Those that she let stay, she ended up taxing at exorbitant rates. So all these ingredients go into a pot of cold water, and then I add whole peppercorns, and then I bring it to a boil and let it simmer for about an hour. The famous Prague cemetery was open for 400 years, and there are over 200,000 Jews buried in it. It's not a very big plot of land, and its capacity is actually only about 10% of the actual numbers of people buried there. So many of the plots have had to go 12 layers deep into the earth. In order to accommodate so many people, they had to layer soil, and so the Jewish cemetery is actually on higher ground than the surrounding areas of the city, and that's why it has retaining walls around it to keep it intact. Now we prepare the matzah. You'll need matzah meal, eggs, and oil. I use vegetable oil, but if you're making a chicken broth, you can use chicken fat. Mix these ingredients well. Matzah represents the unleavened bread that the Jews ate while fleeing Egypt. They didn't have time to let normal bread rise, so they made flat matzah crackers, another food I grew up on. After we mix the ingredients, we'll set it in the refrigerator for about 2 hours. Maria Theresa's son, Joseph II, was a lot more enlightened than his mother. So in 1781, he started to give more rights to the non-Catholic populations of the empire, but in 1782, he expanded that to the Jews in the Edict of Tolerance. Its goal was to include the Jews as citizens in the empire. So they were allowed to go to schools, they were allowed to attend universities, but they were also forced to learn the local language. So in this case, it would have been German. And he also let them learn and practice certain trades that they hadn't been allowed to practice before. In 1850, the Jewish Quarter officially became the 5th quarter of Prague, and it was named Josefov in honor of Joseph II and his acts of tolerance towards the Jews. Some people like to serve the soup with only broth and matzo balls, but I like some chunky vegetables. So I'm going to peel some carrots and cut them up like little coins. I also cut up some celery and more parsley. I'll put those aside until the last 10 minutes of cooking and check on my broth. As part of the effort to incorporate Jews more into society, Joseph's new acts of tolerance allowed the Jews to move out of the Jewish quarter, which many of the wealthier ones did. But the people who remained in the Jewish quarter were the poorer Jews, and also the poorer Praguers congregated there too. It became very overcrowded, and towards the end, there were over 18,000 people living in a very small area. And it started to degrade into pretty unhygienic living conditions. So at the turn of the century, the city of Prague decided to raze the entire quarter. They left only the 6 synagogues, the cemetery, and the Jewish town hall. And then they remodeled the quarter in the style of Paris, and they named the street Pařížská, or Paris Street, in the center. And those are the buildings that you will see today if you come to visit. Prague is also the home of the most famous Golem, created by Prague's most well-known rabbi, Rabbi Lowe, or the Maharal. Legend says that Rabbi Lowe used the clay on the banks of the Vltava River to create this golem, this sort of not quite human character, to defend the Jews against threats from outside, from pogroms and people who wished them harm. Legend says that he still lives in the attic of the old new synagogue and is waiting to be reactivated when he's called upon. Now we form the balls. By now the mixture should be firm. If you wet your hands with a bit of water, it's easier to form a 2 to 3 centimeter ball with your hands. They will puff up to almost twice the size. Drop them carefully one by one into a pot of boiling water and simmer for 40 minutes. I think that Prague's most colorful building is the Jubilee Synagogue, or the Jerusalem Synagogue. It was completed in 1907, and it's not in the Jewish quarter, it's near Hlavní nádraží, the main train station. And it was given almost as compensation to the Jews after having razed the Jewish quarter and destroyed most of the buildings there. It was named the Jubilee Synagogue in celebration of Franz Joseph I on the celebration of his Jubilee as emperor. But then when Czechoslovakia became an independent state, it was renamed the Jerusalem Synagogue. After the broth is done simmering, remove the roughly cut vegetables and discard them. About 10 minutes before the matzo balls are done, add other vegetables to the broth and let them simmer. Prague has the best preserved complex of Jewish historical artifacts in all of Europe. But this fact has unfortunate roots. When the Nazis invaded Prague, they wanted to maintain the Jewish quarter as sort of a monument to a race that had been eradicated from the earth. So all of the Jewish artifacts and monuments that had been collected from the invaded territories were sent to Prague and kept there. This is also the reason that the old cemetery went unscathed when so many other Jewish cemeteries in the invaded lands were desecrated or used as target practice. Then we ladle the matzo balls into a bowl and pour the broth. And we give it the husband test.
Oh my God.
Phew, I passed. The next time you're in Prague, I highly recommend a guided tour through the Jewish quarter. Until next year in Prague, L'chaim.